In the last few days, there has been a flurry of DC rumors, both verified reports of movie delays as well as negative test screening reactions for James Gunn's Superman, none of which bode well for the upcoming DC Universe reboot. So, what is going on, and should we be worried? Let's find out. In the past couple of days, both the first Batman movie native to James Gunn's DC Universe, as well as the sequel to Pattinson's The Batman, have both been pushed back to 2027, while there is a new batch of rumors suggesting that the first test screenings for next year's Superman reboot did not go well, none of which is going to cause much in the way of hype or excitement for fans who want to see DC on film thrive. Let's begin with The Batman Part 2, which has just been pushed back to 2027, which means it doesn't have to film until 2026, which in turn means they now have more than a year to finish up the script and plan the production. Considering just how many years writer and director Matt Reeves needed to finish up the script for the first movie, that in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. But on the flip side, if The Batman Part 2 ever had momentum, it was right now, in the aftermath of the surprise hit of The Penguin on HBO Max. Given that momentum, they honestly needed to film this thing right now or in 3 months at the latest, and have it out in early 2026 by the latest. As it stands, it doesn't even have to film by early 2026, and by then, all momentum it had inside the studio will be gone. As both we, and especially our good friend Script Doctor, has maintained for years now, every time that movie is pushed back, the chance that it ever gets made diminishes even further. As long-time viewers will know, Midnight's Edge's very own Tom Connors has broken several scoops on the happenings behind the scenes of DC and Warner, particularly during the Zaslav transition, and his sources consistently maintained that The Batman Part 2 even happening was predicated on the success of The Penguin. And the fact that the script for the sequel isn't even remotely finished several years after the release of the first movie and over a year since The Penguin finished production supports this reporting. Sure, Matt Reeves may have been working on it in the background all along, but this new date gives Reeves more than ample time to get this thing done. Consider, Dune Part 3 will be rushed and out in theaters around the same time The Batman Part 2 will reportedly begin production, and that says something. The fact of the matter is that the first, The Batman, was never big enough a hit to fast-track a sequel. As Tom reported at the time, Warner decided that the movie was sufficiently successful that they weren't beholden to the Snyderverse, but the mixed response caused Part 2 to be re-evaluated. By contrast, the reaction to the first Joker was strong enough that they fast-tracked a sequel for that, even though there were zero plans for one, and as it turned out, they put a little bit too much faith in the director. Meanwhile, The Batman Part 2 kept being pushed back. The first, The Batman, was never big enough a hit to fast-track a sequel. The Penguin gave that sequel new momentum, but in a year from now, that momentum will have faded, replaced with the question that always will have been on the studio's mind. Why are we keeping a competing DC universe that can only sow audience confusion alive? And that question will only ring louder and louder the more time passes without the movie having a formal green light. So this most recent delay may just have made it even more likely that the movie never happens than that it does. Something that is much more likely to happen is James Gunn's inevitable Batman reboot set inside the main DC Universe continuity alongside the recently announced Clayface, an announcement that was obviously timed to coincide with the character's debut in Episode 5 of Creature Commandos, which was released earlier this week. Creature Commandos, of course, is the first canonical installment of James Gunn's DC Universe. But let's get back to Batman, because that delay doesn't worry me nearly as much. In the case of this Batman project, Batman the Brave and the Bold, it is my personal opinion that that project was always headed down the wrong path to begin with, and that this most recent delay means that they're giving it the rethink it probably should have had before it was announced in the first place. You see, Batman the Brave and the Bold, a movie which was planned to heavily feature the Bat family and especially Batman's son, Damian Wayne, was set to be made by the same director who also made The Flash, and this was stupidly announced just prior to the release of The Flash. When The Flash then came out and was reviled by the audience and subsequently bombed big time, then that kind of put a big damper on any and all hype for Batman the Brave and the Bold. I always maintained that the director had to go after that, and indeed, he just let it be known on social media that with this delay, he may have to do another movie before Batman, which obviously is code for that he has been out of Batman for a long time already, and he no longer has any role in that movie's development. And then, when he gets attached to another movie, then scheduling conflicts will prevent him from returning to Batman, thus allowing him to drop out, period, without losing too much face. But of course, anyone who knows he directed The Flash will know he was never going to direct the Batman reboot after that. They were just keeping up the charade to save face in public. Hopefully, by the time that project remerges in its final form, it will do so without Damian Wayne, a character no one really wants to see on film, certainly not yet. Either way, both of these proposed Batman projects are years away. The far greater concern is the upcoming Superman, which is due out this summer. Many are nervous about the movie, some are actively rooting against it, and I'm not too convinced the trailer changed the minds of those already primed to dislike it, even if the response was overall positive. Because let's be clear about that, there are many who really want to see that movie crash and burn. In the fan community, you obviously have these Snyder fans who still remain, though their anger is misplaced. They should be angry at the Batman, and if they ever paid to see it, at themselves for doing so. Because as Tom's sources always maintained, the Batman was a test to see if the audience were willing to accept something else. So every single ticket bought for the Batman was in reality a vote against the Snyderverse. And as we already covered, that movie was sufficiently successful to tell Warner they weren't beholden to Snyder. But that fanbase aside, there are many in Hollywood that are really rooting for the movie to fail because they hate David Zaslav that much. David Zaslav, the head of Warner Bros. Discovery, is the orange man bad of Hollywood, and the hatred many in Hollywood and the associated trades harbor against him is greater than whatever love they may feel for James Gunn. So if Gunn is on Team Zaslav, which he is, they'll root for him to fail if that means Zaslav fails. They hate him that badly because, like the real Orange Man, they see him as an outsider who dares come into their lovely swamp and stir up how they like things to be done. Always keep that in mind when reading negative news directly or indirectly pertaining to Warner. While no one will admit it out loud, there are numerous producers, agents, pundits, and even journalists that wants to see everything he does fail, up to and including James Gunn's Superman. We saw this even with the Superman trailer, where leading up to its release, there were rumors that the studio were unhappy with it. Something Gunn shut down by maintaining that where DC is concerned, he is the studio. But alas, that didn't put an end to worries and doubts, let alone the desire to see Superman fail. On the contrary, we just got a new round of negative press, this time seeded by Jeff Snyder, formerly of Collider fame among other things. The best work he ever did, of course, was back in 2006, when he got his ass handed to him in the ring by Uwe Boll, that time when Boll challenged his critics to a boxing match, and his critics thought Boll was just going to play fight. He wasn't. Either way, on his most recent installment of the Hot Mic podcast, which you can find linked in the description so you can hear his own words in full context, Snyder described what he had heard, and remember, this is someone with the connections to know. The most relevant bits were presented by Cosmic Book News though, so let's visit their quotes. Snyder said, "I went to dinner with a source who knew multiple people who had seen Superman. The buzz is not good. It's not me trying to take the movie down. Well, it is a little bit. Maybe I misphrased the VFX things. I'm hearing bad things. I'm hearing you should be worried things. Now, there's a lot of time between now and July 11th. A lot of things could happen. Sounds like James Gunn is aware of some of the feedback." Yeah, you'd think so. More on that later. Snyder then referenced The Hollywood Reporter, who in a recent newsletter wrote, "We've heard from multiple sources about one screening in particular, on the lot and with his close-knit crew of people he trusts. We're keeping the buzz about the movie itself in our own Fortress of Solitude, but we can tell you that the movie will be doing a few days of additional shooting in Los Angeles in the near term." Referencing that quote from The Hollywood Reporter, Snyder then said, "Sounds like The Hollywood Reporter is aware of some of the feedback, or they're just keeping that amazing buzz that the studio would love to have out there in the Fortress of Solitude. Read between the lines, people. And what Snyder wants you to read between the lines is that the movie is bad. But what I submit you perhaps should take away instead is that since The Hollywood Reporter confirms it, screenings have been held. Not public test screenings for random audiences that sign an NDA but then go on to spoil what they saw on Reddit anyway. No, not those kinds of screenings. But as The Hollywood Reporter said, screenings for select invitees and confidants in whose opinion Gunn trusts. Screenings like that are in fact pretty important, and they're all about getting feedback, so of course James Gunn knows the feedback. Case in point, the original Star Wars was torn a new one in screenings like these for George Lucas filmmaker friends, and that feedback is what allowed them to save the movie in the editing bay. So just that the movie still needs work at the time of such screenings is in and of itself not a disaster. Remember, the whole purpose of these screenings is indeed to make the movies better. Even back when Marvel knew what they were doing a decade ago, they would dub the very earliest cuts of their movies that were subject to screenings like these, off-yourself cuts, if you catch my drift, because that's what they felt like doing when that feedback came in. And yet, that feedback is what allowed them to make the movies better and get them in shape for the much later public test screenings. What I'm saying is that some negative feedback from very early test screenings of even earlier cuts like this is to be expected. Inadvertently supporting that news here really isn't all that bad was Snyder's partner in crime John Rocha, he who has a history of screaming at men to do better when they fail to embrace and submit to girl bosses. Here, he added, "Someone who has seen Superman told me it was the tone of the first Captain America movie and the Mummy film," at which point Snyder laughed and yelled out, "That's bad." But let's be clear, Rocha's source never said that. That was Snyder revealing how much he wants the movie to be bad. About the comparison, I would say, yeah, if you're referencing the Tom Cruise Mummy, which was written and directed by Alex Kurtzman, the destroyer of Star Trek, yeah, that's bad. But if the source referred to the Brendan Fraser Mummy, however, that tonally actually sounds pretty spot on to me. Either way, Rocha continued relaying what he learned from his sources. They said Nicholas Hoult is the standout, and the film was decent, but a large chunk of the film was unfinished, with only a third of the film's VFX being done. Well, obviously, this is the screening for confidants aimed at making the movie better. You finish the VFX when the cut is mostly locked, which only happens later. Their source continued, least amount of humor of any Gunn film, but there's still humor throughout the film. And here's the most important bit, namely the verdict of the one who actually saw this still in progress cut of the movie. They think most people will be satisfied with the movie, and it should be received well enough to continue Gunn's DCU. That's what I would be inclined to believe as well, just based on these reports. The headlines of articles and videos derived from this initial seed story may read as negative, but go into the detail and you'll find that for such an early cut, this is not too shabby feedback. That's the feedback of a movie which, with further tweaks, has the potential to turn out pretty decent. The headlines have been negative though, because as I said before, many aren't interested in the nuance or detail, they just want to stick it to Zaslav and are very happy to use Superman to do that. As such, we have a counter-report coming from DCU Super News on X, which reads, "Journalist Matthias Lertora addresses recent negative Superman test screening rumors. There has been no test screening for Superman recently. I know this from an excellent source. Don't believe anything you read." At first glance, that would appear to fall into the "trust me bro" category, but Tom's sources also confirm that there have been no recent screenings, as everything is shut down for Christmas and New Year's. So what is circulating here are just older accounts of test screenings that happened some time ago, wrapped into new reports that frame them as negative. Now, it's not for me to say that the movie is definitely going to be awesome or anything like that, but based on the detail in the actual screening accounts, especially the one relayed by John Rocha, to me this sounds like an early cut still in need of work, and both the best and worst of movies were in such a place at some point in the editing process. That's why closed internal test screenings like these are held in the first place, long before any test screenings for the public are held. In some cases, like Star Wars or even the first Rambo movie, feedback from such screenings is what saved them. In others, like John Carter, problems were too deeply rooted. Batman v Superman even got standing ovation in its internal screenings, yet no viewers shared that assessment. Case in point, James Gunn's DC on film is obviously a work in progress, but it's premature to write it off completely, as things may not be as bad as some reports and headlines would have you believe. So, do you think Superman can turn DC around, and will we ever get that The Batman Part 2? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.